Michael Morley's handwritten account, continued. It is safe to say that ever since the blackouts and the 3-day weeks began in late 1974, the streets of Moorton had been far more deserted in the evenings than they ever would have been before. Still, there were a few souls who out of necessity or stupidity would still venture out in the dark, even in the absence of electric lights and with most businesses entirely closed by the time the sun went down. That was until the howling started. Once that sound kicked into gear and the stories dragged behind, it began to slither through the town. Even the few individuals who had been brave enough to venture out changed their minds. What had been a few scores was reduced to perhaps a dozen, and even they did not go out willingly. So it was that on that night, after reading the details of werewolf lore, I walked through narrow, still cobbled streets with not a single other soul in sight. I had returned home the previous night just before dawn. I had spent most of the day in my room, only coming down for meals. On my way to the living room for lunch, I saw my father lift the local newspaper from the doormat. Having glanced at the headline, he stuffed the entire paper under his shirt, clearly intending to throw it away or dispose of it somehow before either I or my mother saw it. I knew what the paper would say. They would say that Dawn was missing, perhaps mention other women and children who had fallen into the water and drowned. It had happened before. There would be no mention of wolves. To say that I felt lonely racing through the Moorton streets that night would be an exaggeration. I had spent the entire day counting the minutes till bedtime, when I might be able to once again slip out of my bedroom window and do what I needed to do. I was far too preoccupied to worry about being alone. To say I was lonely would be an exaggeration. To say that I was scared would be an understatement. By that point, I was terrified. Sprinting between the rows of stone-built cottages and solid Victorian houses, I dodged and swerved at every sound and shadow. When a cat, disrupted by the sound of my boots clattering down the street, darted out from behind a bin, I jumped from the center of the road to the curb with a level of agility I would never have thought myself capable of. My senses, it seemed, had been heightened, my reflexes stripped to a raw, hair-trigger level of sensitivity. I leapt at every sound and darted at every movement as I approached my destination. Standing outside of the building for a moment, I hesitated. I saw myself reflected in the plate glass of the shop front window, beautifully etched with the shop name, Moorton Sewing Box. Thread, knitting wool, and fabric supplies. Many years later, the local kids would joke about a local woman who visited this strange little shop every single day, only to stop joking abruptly when they read of sinister uses she had conjured up for that yarn. On that night, though, many years before those events, I felt a pang of preemptive guilt, knowing that what I was about to do would likely cost the owners a pretty penny. On the other hand, this evil had already cost people their lives and could take mine by the end of the night if I went in under-equipped. So, steeling myself for what I was about to do, I vaulted the wall around the back of the premises, and using a heavy brick I found at its base, smashed again and again at the padlock that held fast the back door. Within minutes I was inside and had retrieved from the box by the window exactly the items I'd come to collect. I stuffed them into a large canvas bag I had lifted from one of the displays, and shaking my head with guilt and apprehension made my way out the same way I had come in. Then I headed for Blackwell's. Sure enough, when I arrived at the old man's house set back from the road with thick vegetation at the front, I could see from the flickering of candles inside that Mr. Blackwell was still awake. There had been no howling yet that night, which meant I still had time. Slowly and cautiously I approached the building, squatting down to below the height of the front wall to avoid being seen. Reaching up, I unclasped the gate, eased it back on its hinge, and slipped into the front garden, still hunched and squatted. As I passed into the garden, I noted that most of the foxglove was gone. Clearly, it had not been removed because Mr. Blackwell was worried about its toxicity because a few stems and bulbs remained. Rather, the bunches I had seen months earlier had been plucked and dried, then used. I made my preparations, moving as slowly and as quietly as I could, terrified that at any moment the door would open, that I would be spotted and dragged inside. What was, in reality, the work of minutes seemed to take hours as I slowly and carefully took from inside the canvas bag the solid silver buttons I had taken from the sewing box and laid them with infinite care in long shimmering rows along the front doorstep, the window ledge and later in front of the back door, making sure in every case to ensure that each button was touching the next, creating a single solid line, an unbroken chain and a border of silver. Having set up this strange ornamentation, I again crept, cautiously and silently, this time out of the garden. Once I had reached the edge of the wall, I straightened up and ran as fast as I could back to the town square and the payphone that stood at its edge. The call was to the police precinct. I asked for and got through to Paul Whale. Then I started screaming, crying bloody murder and shouting that Mr. Blackwell was killing a child, that he had her right now, that they needed to come this instant. I also told him to bring a dog. The time that I waited, hunched down in an entry opposite Mr. Blackwell's house, was one of the longest stretches of barren time I have ever endured in my life. I felt sure, certain even, that with every passing second we would be closer to hearing the howling, to a creature neither man nor animal but some hideous hybrid mix of both, emerging from that tiny house. Seeing Whale approach from the other end of the street was like seeing a contradiction in human form. He had not driven to the house, racing up the high street at top speed in response to an urgent call or an emergency. Instead, he ambled slowly up to the house to investigate. Clearly, he was unconvinced by the call, and knowing the voice to be that of a teenager, assumed it was a prank. Still, he had deemed it worthy of investigation, something he probably should check out, and whilst he clearly didn't believe that Mr. Blackwell was actually murdering anyone in that little house, he had acquiesced to the caller's request and chosen to bring his dog. When Whale got within 10 meters of the house, I emerged from my hiding place and rushed toward him, words spilling from my mouth in such a rambling stream that he seemed genuinely taken aback. Eventually, I caught hold of myself, took a deep breath and asked him to follow me to the end of the street, out of sight and earshot of Blackwell's house. Then I tried to explain. To his credit, Whale listened attentively to my story. He did not interrupt or shout me down and chastise me for making a ridiculous call and wasting police time. Perhaps he was aware of how jumpy and anxious recent events had made the townsfolk. Perhaps he knew who I was and that my sister was missing. Maybe, I thought, he believed me, but he didn't. When I had finally finished, Whale simply shook his head.
It's an interesting story, Sunshine, but I don't believe in werewolves. Now, Mr. Blackwell might not be the friendliest of folk, but just because he has some sort of weird daffodil growing in his garden doesn't make him a monster, and I am not going to go bothering him at this time of night based on that.
"Take the dog," I screamed at him. "Take the dog up to the house if you don't believe me. See how it reacts. You'll see if I'm lying." If I'm honest, what I had expected was not what happened. A diet of hammer horror movies and pulpy fiction novels had led me to believe that dogs had some form of sixth sense, that they would bark and growl in the presence of evil, their lips drawing back and fangs exposed. Of course, at the time, I didn't know about the conversation Whale had conducted previously about how the dogs had reacted when that thing had approached the kennels. If I'm honest, I had expected him to refuse, but he didn't. Instead, he sighed deeply and wrapped the dog's lead once more around his wrist, making sure to have a firmer, tighter grip on the animal.
"Okay,"
he said, shaking his head softly.
"I'll take him up there and see what happens, eh? But I'm telling you now, if nothing happens, we are going straight home, and I will be having some very strong words with your parents, young man."
I nodded furiously that I understood.
"You wait here. I still want a few words with you before you go."
With that, Whale turned and walked slowly and cautiously toward Mr. Blackwell's house. As I watched in nervous anticipation, the dog simply trotted along, happy to be out on a walk and unaware that it was participating in some kind of man or perhaps monster hunt. It padded slowly up the street a few steps in front of Whale, its tail wagging gently, and stopped every few feet to lower its head and sniff for signs of other dogs and where they might have been. When it came to Blackwell's wall, the dog stopped dead. Whale tugged on the lead, but the dog remained fixed in place. Then, slowly but surely, its eyes fixed on where it had just detected the scent. Whale glanced back at me, then down at the dog. He gave the lead another sharp pull as if trying to jerk the animal back to life, but the dog remained rigid and frozen in place. I watched on in silence. Around me, the world seems to have taken on a glassy, almost frozen stillness, as if these two players on a dark and lonely stage were the only living creatures on Earth. I saw them there, a few hundred meters away. Dark, but clearly cut silhouettes, and saw the moon, full and bright above them.
"Come on, boy, don't start messing me around,"
Whale said, loudly enough for me to hear at the end of the street. I could see from his posture, from the way he had begun rocking and stepping from one foot to the other, that his bravery and certainty were slowly beginning to leak and ebb away.
If he's scared, I thought, then what hope do I have?
Whale tugged again at the leash. The dog replied with a whimper and arching its back in a cringing, craven retreat. It lowered its head and curled its tail under itself as if trying to hide it. It didn't bark, it didn't growl. Instead, it melted, shrinking and receding into abject submission. The poor creature was terrified. I wanted to turn, to run in the other direction, to leave this matter to the police. Had it not been for thoughts of Dawn, I probably would have. The dog dropped its chest and belly to the ground and rolled onto its back, a submissive gesture that I now know resonated with Whale more than I could have known. Dropping the leash and leaving the dog lying where it was, he began walking back toward me.
"Listen,"
he said.
"There's something weird going on here, okay? But I think we'd all be best coming back to investigate in the morning. I'll take you home, and in the cold light of day, we'll come back and—"
I didn't even have time to protest. Before Whale had even finished the sentence, the howl again rang out across Moorton. This time, however, it was not a sound carried on the air that bled into every home, a sound that was everywhere and nowhere at once with no discernible origin. This howl was coming from somewhere specific. It was coming from Blackwell's house.